The rain came down in relentless sheets, turning the city into a landscape of mirrors and shadows. Ava Morgan walked with her head bent low, her hospital scrubs clinging to her skin, soaked through after 12 hours in the trauma ward of St. Vincent Medical Center. Her shoes squelched with every step, the rhythm of exhaustion beating against the slick pavement. Around her, the streets were almost deserted, save for the echo of distant sirens and the whisper of tires slicing through puddles. She pulled her thin jacket tighter, though it did little to block the cold that seeped into her bones. The night smelled of asphalt, disinfectant, and fatigue. Ava had seen 3 cardiac arrests that day. 2 patients survived, 1 did not. A toddler had nearly choked on a plastic toy, a teenage boy had arrived with knife wounds, and a man in his 40s had collapsed in the waiting room clutching his chest. Every shift at the emergency department was a balancing act between control and chaos, compassion and numbness. Now, as she turned down Westbrook Avenue, a shortcut she knew she should avoid, she felt her body moving purely on memory, her mind somewhere between wakefulness and the desire to collapse. Steam rose from the grates like ghosts, swirling beneath the flickering streetlights. Ava barely noticed. Her thoughts drifted to her apartment, to the small heater that only worked when it wanted to, and the promise of sleep that waited like a distant miracle. She was so deep in the rhythm of her exhaustion that the sound reached her late, a muffled groan swallowed by the rain. She stopped. For a heartbeat, she told herself it was nothing. Just the wind. Just the city breathing. But then it came again, weaker this time, human and desperate. Her pulse quickened. She turned toward the narrow alley between a shuttered laundromat and a corner store with barred windows. The light from the street barely reached inside, but she could make out a dark shape slumped against a dumpster. She hesitated, instincts clashing, training against fear. The alley smelled of metal, garbage, and something darker. Blood. She stepped forward, rain dripping from her hair into her eyes. The man was half conscious, one hand pressed against his side, the other limp beside him. His expensive suit was ruined, soaked through and stained crimson. Even in the dim light, Ava recognized the sheen of fresh blood spreading beneath his fingers. Her brain reacted before her fear could. She dropped her bag, unzipped the emergency kit she carried everywhere, and knelt beside him. "Stay still," she said, her voice steady out of habit, though her heart was hammering. "You have a gunshot wound." "Leave me," he rasped, his tone commanding, despite the weakness. His voice was deep, touched with an accent she could not place. "They might come back." Ava ignored him. "I need to stop the bleeding." He caught her wrist with surprising strength. "No hospitals." His eyes, shadowed but burning with intensity, met hers. They were green, sharp, and vivid, even in the gloom, the kind of eyes that made people obey without question. But Ava was not one of those people. She gently pulled her hand free, pressing gauze against the wound. "You will not die in an alley tonight," she said, her words simple, final. He stared at her for a moment, then gave a short, sharp exhale, half a laugh, half a surrender. Ava worked quickly, her fingers steady as she packed the wound, cleaned what she could, and wrapped a bandage tight around his torso. The rain mixed with blood, streaking her hands in shades of red and gray. His breathing steadied slightly. The faint rise and fall of his chest became more regular. "Why are you helping me?" he asked after a while, his voice quieter now. "You have no idea who I am." "Right now, you are just someone who needs help," she answered, not looking up. "That is all that matters." His lips curved faintly. Not quite a smile. Most people would have walked away. "I am not most people." Something flickered in his expression, respect, maybe, or curiosity. The kind of look that felt like being measured and remembered. He moved slightly, and the streetlight caught his face. Strong jawline. Sharp cheekbones, a trace of stubble darkening his skin. The rain made him look almost unreal, like a figure sculpted from shadow and defiance, too handsome to be ordinary, too dangerous to be safe. "My name is Adrian," he said finally. "Adrian Moretti. Remember it." Ava met his gaze, unflinching. "Ava Morgan." For a long moment, the only sound between them was the rhythm of the rain and the distant hum of city traffic. Then headlights flared at the end of the alley. 3 black SUVs slid to a stop, their engines low and menacing. The air changed sharp, electric. Doors opened in perfect synchronization, and men in dark suits stepped out, their movements precise and disciplined. Weapons glinted under the dim street lights. Adrian's hand closed around her wrist again, firmer this time. "Say nothing," he whispered. "Forget my face." Before she could respond, the men surrounded them, forming a tight circle. One of them, tall with cold eyes, looked down at Adrian. "Boss, we found you. The tracker worked." "I am fine," Adrian said, his tone suddenly different, commanding. "Absolute, thanks to this nurse." The word nurse hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The men's gazes turned toward Ava, their suspicion clear. She stayed still, forcing herself to breathe evenly. One of them asked, "Is she compromised?" "She helped me," Adrian replied. "That makes her valuable. For now," as if 2 men moved to lift him, careful of his wound. He stood, taller than she expected, his presence filling the narrow space like gravity. Rain dripped from his dark hair, down the curve of his jaw, across the edge of the bandage she had wrapped. He looked down at her again, and for a heartbeat, something passed between them, an unspoken recognition, a silent promise neither could explain. "Take her information," he ordered. "Then let her go. She has done me a service tonight." The men obeyed. One of them took her name and address, his expression unreadable. When they left, the roar of the engines faded slowly into the rain, leaving Ava alone in the alley with her soaked scrubs, trembling hands, and the distant echo of what she had just stepped into. She stood there for a long time, the cold pressing against her like a weight. Somewhere in the city, a siren wailed. She picked up her medical kit, numb and shivering, and began to walk home, not realizing that her life, every quiet routine, every dream of safety, had ended the moment she said, "You will not die in an alley tonight." Morning arrived like a thin blade of light, slipping between the blinds and slicing through the restless haze that had replaced sleep. Ava Morgan lay on her back and watched dust drift in the gold ribbon, each mote rising and falling as if the air itself could not decide whether to surrender to gravity or defy it. Her apartment smelled faintly of antiseptic from the kit she had cleaned at 2 in the morning and of the coffee she had brewed far too late to be wise. She listened for ordinary sounds that usually anchored the day. A neighbor's radio, pipes creaking in the walls, a bus groaning to a stop at the corner. The city obliged her with a scattered chorus of normalcy, but the memory of the alley stepped in front of every sound and held it hostage. She had told herself again and again that she had done what any decent person trained to save lives would do. She had told herself that the men in the suits would forget her as soon as their boss was safe. She had told herself that the name Adrian Moretti was only a name like any other, like a word seen on a restaurant sign, or a headline glanced at and ignored. The words felt thin in the mouth of her thoughts now, insubstantial as tissue. She rose, showered, dressed, and moved through the small space as if she might wake it by example. The mirror showed a face that belonged to her, and did not. Her eyes looked older than they had yesterday. The bruise of exhaustion under them seemed deeper, like a throb in the air rather than only in her skin. At St. Vincent Medical Center, the fluorescent lights hummed with their usual relentless cheer, the smell of disinfectant and overbrewed coffee hovering in the corridors. Ava entered the locker room and changed into fresh scrubs, the cotton cool against her skin, the familiar ritual almost enough to steady her. Almost. Nurses spoke in quick, low voices, the way people speak when they are both bored and braced for catastrophe. By the time Ava reached the nurses' station, the story had already arrived ahead of her. A shooting. 3 vehicles. A power figure attacked near Westbrook Avenue. Rumors of rival syndicates moving in the dark. Natalie Cruz found her by the charting computer, eyes bright with the kind of excitement that lives where curiosity and fear touch. Natalie's hand closed around Ava's forearm, not roughly, but with urgency. She asked if Ava had heard. She said it happened close to Ava's place. She said someone had whispered a name that made every conversation drop to a murmur. Adrian Moretti. The syllables landed between them like coins on a table, dull and heavy. Ava forced her face to be still. She said that she had heard sirens. She said that her street had been quiet by morning. She said that she hoped no one had died. All of it was true. None of it was all of the truth. The day slid into its old rhythm with the stubbornness of a river that refuses to admit a storm has changed it. Admissions rose and fell, alarms barked and subsided. Ava moved from bed to bed, resetting monitors, checking lines, coaxing a frightened child to breathe slowly, steadying a man's shaking hands as he signed consent for an emergency procedure. Work demanded attention with a voice stronger than fear, and she obeyed. Each time she paused, the alley returned. The rain, the blood, the impossible green of his eyes holding her in their level gaze. The words he had said, "Say nothing. Forget my face." She could not forget his face. The memory was fixed with the clarity of lightning. After her shift, the sky was an iron plate, dull and heavy, as if the city had been sealed beneath it. She walked home with her bag slung across her shoulder, the strap digging into muscle that had already begun to ache. At the corner before her street, she paused without understanding why she had stopped. The silence felt arranged. That was the first thought. The second came on a colder wind. The street was not empty. It appeared full, but its fullness had a shape. 10 black sport utility vehicles lined the block with deliberate symmetry. Men stood beside them with stillness that did not belong to any ordinary evening. Conversations died as windows along the row of buildings lost their courage and pulled their curtains close. A woman on the second floor held a phone to her ear, eyes wide as if the distance between her and the sidewalk might bend if she blinked. Ava's steps slowed and then halted. The movement of the men was precise and almost soft, which made it more unnatural. One man near the center spoke into the cuff of his sleeve. A second peeled off from the cluster and came toward her with measured strides. He was older, his hair gray at the temples, his posture straight with the memory of discipline. He did not smile. He inclined his head in a gesture that was both greeting and assessment. "Miss Morgan," he said. His voice carried easily, not loud, not apologetic. "Mr. Moretti would like a word." The syllables did not hit like coins this time. They struck more cleanly, like keys laid on a polished desk, each one exactly where it belonged. Ava felt the habit of refusal rise in her. She told herself to ask them to leave. She told herself to call the police. She told herself to move her feet in the opposite direction and keep moving until the sound of the city drowned out the low hum of engines. She did none of these things. Something in the composure of the older man disarmed defiance by recognizing it before it formed. "What does he want?" she said. She kept her voice steady, held the line of her shoulders. She would not give trembling the dignity of an audience. "To thank you," the man answered. He did not pause. "To discuss your safety. To ensure there will be no misunderstanding." The word safety entered the space between them the way a shadow enters a room, changing the shape of everything in it. Ava looked past him at the vehicles, at the drivers with their eyes fixed ahead, at the 2 men posted at the entrance of her building, at the way the block had been redrawn without a mark on the pavement. The ordinary city had been replaced by something that wore its face but not its expression. "I have a shift in the morning," she said. "We will return you in time," the man replied. A bus rumbled by at the far end of the street, and for a moment the illusion broke like a surface rippling. Ava glanced up at the windows. The woman on the second floor stood very still now, phone suspended beside her cheek, as if caught in the act of either calling or ending. Ava imagined the conversations that would grow from this hour, budding in kitchens and hallways, in laundry rooms and elevators. She imagined the police cars that might come too late and ask careful questions that expected careful answers. She imagined Adrian Moretti standing at a window high above the city, looking down at streets that belong to him the way a game belongs to the player, who knows that the pieces will move exactly where he requires them to go. The older man waited without impatience. It was not a sales pitch, it was not a threat spoken out loud, it was something like a statement of gravity, and gravity did not care whether an apple agreed to fall. "All right," Ava said. The words were calm and quiet. They sounded like the voice she used when a patient was about to be wheeled through double doors that closed behind them and made a new reality on the other side. He nodded once, as if acknowledging a decision he had already recorded. He gestured toward the central vehicle, and the men at the door stepped aside with a choreography that had been practiced until it no longer looked like practice. The door opened with a sound that felt more final than it should have. Leather. Low light. The faint smell of something expensive and cool, as if the air had been distilled and taught to behave. Ava paused with one hand on the frame and looked back at her building. The stairwell light flickered as if trying to blink a message no one could decode. She thought of the hospital, the relentless brightness of the corridors, the way a pulse sounds in the quiet room before dawn when a monitor measures the slow climb back to safety. She thought of the alley, the rain, the blood, the eyes that had met hers without flinching. She stepped into the vehicle and sat down, the door closing with a click that drew a line through the evening and divided it into before and after. The motor whispered. The procession moved. The city slid past the tinted window in bands of neon and brick and shadow, as if someone were pulling film through a projector. Ava kept her hands folded in her lap and watched the reflections touch and vanish on the glass. The older man sat across from her, respectful and silent. She did not ask how long the ride would be. She did not count the turns. She felt the change in elevation as the car began to rise, somewhere deep beneath a tower of steel and glass, the elevator climbing with the smooth certainty of a blade leaving its sheath. Somewhere above, the stranger with emerald eyes was waiting, and the door that would open next would not lead back to anything she had ever known. The elevator opened with a whisper, and Ava Morgan stepped into a world so far removed from the one she had left behind that for a moment she could not breathe. The air smelled of polished stone and faint cologne, of wealth that had learned how to hide its own noise. The space before her was all glass and silence, an open expanse that overlooked the glittering veins of the city far below. The skyline shimmered against a velvet sky, the rain-slick streets catching the reflections of countless lights. It was beauty and menace distilled into architecture. A man waited at the window, his back to her. Posture immaculate, shoulders squared as if he had been carved from stillness itself. When he turned, the world she had glimpsed in that alley came rushing back, the same face but different, now no longer pale with blood loss or shadowed by pain. The green eyes she remembered were sharper, alert, alive with command. Adrian Moretti looked like he had never been shot at all. The immaculate suit fit his frame perfectly, the lines of the fabric more deliberate than any armor. Ava stopped a few paces inside the doorway. The older man who had escorted her from the car gave a slight bow of the head and disappeared back into the elevator. The soft click of the doors closing behind her sounded like a lock sealing a chamber. She was alone with him again, but this time the silence between them carried weight. "Miss Morgan," he said, his voice calm, measured, without a hint of weakness, "you made the right decision coming here." She did not answer. Her eyes moved across the room, searching for something familiar to hold on to, a clock, a plant, anything human. Instead, she found glass sculptures, muted paintings, and the low hum of distant thunder pressing against the windows. It was a room designed for control. Adrian poured amber liquid from a crystal decanter into 2 glasses and held one out to her. She hesitated before taking it, the glass cool against her palm. "You saved my life," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Most people would have walked away. I was doing my job." She replied, voice steady but quiet. "That is what nurses do." "Perhaps," he said, sipping his drink. "But most nurses would not have stayed in that alley when 3 cars of armed men arrived." He spurs. "I was not given much of a choice," she said. A faint curve touched his mouth. Not quite amusement, not quite admiration. "You are honest. I value that." He set his glass down and gestured toward the wide windows. You see the city? It looks peaceful from up here. But beneath that calm, it never stops bleeding. You know that better than anyone. You patch up its wounds every day. Ava followed his gaze to the sea of lights. You make it sound as if you own the city, she said. Perhaps I do, he answered simply. At least the parts no one else dares to touch. Her heartbeat stumbled at the quiet certainty in his tone. He turned back toward her, and for a moment she saw what others must see when they spoke his name, the authority, the danger, the gravity of a man who never needed to raise his voice to command obedience. I asked you here because your safety is now tied to mine, he continued. The men who attacked me belong to the Petrov syndicate. They saw you that night. That makes you a target. Ava felt the chill move through her, cold and deliberate. You are saying they would come after me because I helped you? Yes, he said. They do not distinguish between kindness and loyalty. To them, they are the same sin. She set her glass down untouched. Then I will go to the police. Adrian's expression did not change, but something in the air tightened. You believe the police can protect you from them? The Petrov family has been at war with mine for 10 years. They own half the city's silence. The other half is afraid to speak. He walked closer, not threateningly, but with the gravity of someone who did not approach often. I am offering you protection, a place where no one can reach you. In exchange, I ask for your help, discretion, and your skill. My skill, she repeated. You mean as a nurse? He nodded once. We cannot always trust hospitals. Sometimes what happens inside these walls must stay here. You could ensure that. You want me to patch up your soldiers, she said flatly. I want you to treat people who would otherwise die, he said evenly. People who cannot afford to leave a trail. She stared at him, anger flaring through the fear. That is not medicine. That is complicity. For a long moment, he said nothing. The rain began to fall again, tapping against the glass like 1,000 whispered arguments. You speak of the world as though it were divided neatly between right and wrong, he said finally. It is not. You of all people should know that every life you save comes with its own weight of consequences. I took an oath, she said quietly. I do not ask you to break it, he replied. I ask you to look at it from another angle. He stepped closer. The air between them shifted, charged with something unspoken but undeniable. The night you found me, you made a choice. You did not ask who I was. You acted because you saw someone bleeding. That was purity. But purity does not survive long in the real world. You saved me, and now the world will make you pay for it, unless I prevent it. His words hung there, heavy with logic she did not want to accept. He was right about one thing. The world was already punishing her for helping him. She looked at him, seeing not just the man, but the force he represented. Wealth wrapped in violence, power wrapped in purpose, and somewhere beneath it all, something wounded that no amount of control could entirely conceal. I will not be part of your empire, she said at last. Adrian's eyes softened for a fraction of a second. I am not asking you to become part of it, only to survive within it. He turned away then, giving her space to breathe, to think. Stay here tonight, he said. If you still wish to leave in the morning, I will not stop you, but until then, my people will guard you. The Petrov syndicate has already moved once. They will move again. Ava hesitated, every instinct torn between defiance and self-preservation. She wanted to leave, to prove she could walk out of his world untouched. But as she looked at him standing there against the backdrop of the storm, she knew the truth. She could not yet speak aloud. She had already crossed the line that separated their lives. The rain intensified, streaking down the tall glass panes until the city blurred into liquid light. Somewhere below, sirens rose and fell like the city's heartbeat. Ava turned from the window and met his gaze once more. I will stay, she said. For the first time, Adrian's expression shifted into something unreadable, half relief, half calculation. Good, he said softly. Then perhaps we will both sleep easier tonight. But neither of them slept. In the hours that followed, thunder rolled over the city, and Ava sat awake in the quiet guest room, the sheets untouched, her thoughts circling the face of the man who had turned her act of mercy into a bond she could not escape. Outside the penthouse windows, the storm kept its vigil, relentless, unending, washing the city clean for a dawn that would bring nothing pure. The next evening, the city felt different to Ava Morgan, though it looked the same. The neon still bled down, rain darkened glass. The air still smelled of exhaust, metal, and forgotten dreams. But something in its pulse had shifted. It no longer felt like her city, it felt like his. The penthouse had followed her in invisible ways, its quiet authority clinging to her skin even as she walked back into the fluorescent chaos of Street Vincent Medical Center. Work had always been her sanctuary, the one place where purpose made sense. Tonight, the monitors still beeped. The overhead calls still echoed down sterile corridors, but even those sounds failed to settle her. She moved automatically, greeting patients, checking vitals, charting medications, answering questions she barely heard. Her colleagues noticed her distraction, but no one pressed. The ER had its own rhythm of silence. Everyone carried something they did not want to explain. Natalie Cruz found her during a brief lull, leaning against the supply counter with a paper cup of coffee in one hand and a knowing smile on her face. "You disappeared after your shift yesterday," Natalie said. "Everything okay?" Ava forced a faint smile. "Just tired. I needed sleep." "You look more like you need a week on a beach," Natalie teased. "Come on, Ava. I know that look. Something's going on." Ava met her friend's curious gaze and said nothing. She wanted to tell her everything: the alley, the blood, the green eyes that haunted her dreams, but she could not. Words were too dangerous now. Even thinking of his name felt like stepping too close to a live wire. Before she could answer, an alarm blared, calling them back to the trauma bay. The next hours dissolved into a blur of motion and urgency. An elderly stroke victim, a construction accident, a teenage girl overdosed on pills. By the time the shift ended, exhaustion had become a familiar ache, wrapping itself around her like an old friend. She changed into her street clothes, slung her bag over her shoulder, and walked through the underground parking garage toward her car. The concrete echoed with her footsteps, each one louder than the last. The air was thick with the smell of oil and damp metal. Normally, there would be at least one security guard on duty near the entrance, but the booth was empty. The faint hum of a vending machine was the only sound. Something felt wrong. Ava slowed her pace, scanning the shadows between parked cars. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, leaving pockets of darkness deep enough to hide anything or anyone. Her heart began to hammer, the sound loud in her ears. She shifted her keys between her fingers, the jagged edge of one pressing into her palm. It was a meaningless defense, but it made her feel less helpless. She had almost reached her car when she heard it. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, approaching from behind. She turned sharply. 3 men emerged from the shadows, their movements calm, purposeful. They were dressed in dark clothes, faces hardened by something far older than anger. "Miss Morgan," the tallest one said, his accent thick and unfamiliar. "We have been looking for you." Her throat tightened. "Who are you?" "You know who we are," he said. "We are here because of the man you helped. Tell us where Adrian Moretti is." Her blood turned cold. "I do not know." He smiled without warmth. "I think you do. You were seen with him, in the alley. You spoke to him. You touched him. He took a step closer. You patched up the devil himself." "It's Nate." Ava backed away until she felt the metal frame of her car against her spine. "I told you, I do not know where he is." Another man reached for her arm. "He left something with you. Tell us what it was." Panic surged, sharp and clear. "He did not leave me anything." "Then he told you something." The first man's eyes glinted in the dim light. "We can do this the easy way, or—" The rest of the sentence was swallowed by the sudden roar of engines. Headlights flared at the far end of the garage, flooding the space with blinding light. Tires screamed against concrete as 2 black SUVs cut across the lanes, blocking the exit. Everything happened at once. The 3 men spun around, weapons flashing in their hands. Ava dropped to the ground instinctively, her heart in her throat. The sound of gunfire shattered the air, deafening in the enclosed space. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled her lungs. She crawled beneath the car, trembling, her palms scraping against rough cement. Boots pounded past her, shouts in English and Italian colliding in the chaos. The violence felt unreal, like the world had torn open. Then she felt a hand firm, steady grip her shoulder. She froze until she heard the voice, low and familiar. Ava, Adrian. He crouched beside her, his face shadowed but unmistakable. He was dressed in black this time, the tailored lines of his suit blending into the night. His eyes met hers, intense, alive, furious. When I told you that you were in danger, he said, his voice calm even amid the gunfire, this is what I meant. He pulled her out from under the car and shielded her with his body as another volley of bullets echoed through the garage. His men moved with lethal precision, returning fire from behind concrete pillars, sweeping the area with silent efficiency. One of the attackers fell. Another dropped his weapon and ran, only to be caught before reaching the exit. The third lay motionless on the ground, blood spreading across the floor like ink. When the last echo faded, the air felt heavier than before, thick with smoke and silence. Ava stood shaking, her pulse roaring in her ears. Adrian's hand was still on her arm, steady and possessive. You should have stayed at the penthouse, he said quietly. You are not safe here. And so... She wanted to protest, to tell him he had no right to dictate her life, but the words died on her tongue. The image of the man who had just been killed near her car was too vivid. The smell of blood, too familiar. Adrian turned to one of his men. Get her out of here. Now. I can walk, she said, finding her voice again. I know, he replied, but you will not walk alone. The authority in his tone left no room for argument. Two of the suited men guided her toward the SUV while others stayed behind, sweeping the scene, collecting weapons, removing evidence. Everything moved with clockwork precision, as if this sort of cleanup was a language they all spoke fluently. Inside the vehicle, Ava sat rigid, her hands clasped in her lap. Adrian slid in beside her, his presence filling the confined space. For a long moment, neither spoke. The city lights blurred past outside, distorted by her reflection in the tinted glass. I did not ask for this, she whispered finally. No one ever does, he said. But now that it has found you, you cannot pretend it will let you go. The truth in his voice chilled her more than the memory of gunfire. She turned to look at him. What happens now? You come with me, he said simply, until I can be certain they will not touch you again. And if I refuse? His expression softened, but his words remained firm. Then you will die, Ava, and I do not intend to let that happen. The car turned down a narrow street, heading toward the heart of the city, where lights glowed like embers in the rain. She wanted to believe she still had a choice, but deep down she knew the truth. Every choice had already been made the moment she stepped into that alley. Outside, the storm returned, washing over the windshield in violent streaks. Inside, Adrian sat beside her, silent, unyielding, his gaze fixed ahead. The night had swallowed them both, and Ava understood that there was no way back to the world she had once known. The shadows had claimed her, and Adrian Moretti had become both her captor and her only shield. Ava Morgan woke to the sound of quiet. Not city quiet, the muffled kind that comes between sirens or the pause before dawn, but a silence, so complete it felt intentional, designed. She opened her eyes to soft light spilling through sheer curtains that fluttered in a slow rhythm. The room around her was vast and foreign, painted in pale tones that reflected the morning sunday. The sheets beneath her were silk, cool against her skin. The air smelled faintly of sea salt and roses. For a moment she thought she was still dreaming. Then memory came back in fragments, gunfire, the parking garage, Adrian's hand pulling her to safety, the command in his voice that left no room for refusal. She sat up quickly, her heart stuttering. She was still wearing the same clothes from the night before, though someone had draped a soft blanket over her shoulders. The window overlooked a manicured garden stretching into the distance. Beyond the wall of roses stood tall stone fences topped with discreet but unmistakable security measures, cameras, motion sensors, and the faint glint of razor wire. The contrast between beauty and danger was almost surreal. The door opened quietly, and a woman in her 50s entered carrying a tray of coffee and pastries. Her manner was efficient, professional, her expression neither curious nor cold. "Good morning, Miss Morgan," she said. "Mr. Moretti asked me to see that you have breakfast. He will meet you shortly." Ava hesitated. "Where am I?" "You are safe," the woman replied simply, setting the tray down. "This is Mr. Moretti's estate." The word estate felt too small for what Ava saw outside. The garden stretched like a painting, roses in white and deep crimson, hedges trimmed into perfect symmetry, fountains scattering light in liquid arcs. It looked like a sanctuary built by someone who understood both beauty and control. When the woman left, Ava stood by the window, her reflection faint in the glass. The world outside her hospital and apartment was gone, replaced by the silk sheets, guarded gates, and a name that carried more weight than she wanted to bear. The knock on the door was soft but certain. Adrian entered without waiting for an answer, dressed in black again, his expression unreadable. "You should eat," he said. "You have not since last night." "I am not hungry." "You should try," he said again, as though the repetition itself was gentler. Ava crossed her arms, the defiance automatic. "You cannot keep me here." He studied her for a long moment, and then, to her surprise, nodded. "You are right. You can leave, if you wish. But if you step outside those gates now, I cannot protect you." "I never asked for your protection." "No," he agreed quietly. "You asked for nothing. That is why I am offering it." The calm in his tone unsettled her more than anger would have. He spoke like a man used to giving orders no one refused, yet his words carried something that sounded almost like respect. Ava turned away from him, gazing again through the window at the roses. "You live in a fortress," she said. "Is this how you define safety?" "Safety," he replied, "is a luxury built from necessity. Every wall you see has been earned in blood." She turned back toward him, startled by the raw honesty of the admission. Adrian moved closer, his voice lower now. "I did not choose this life, Ava, but I learned how to survive it. You stepped into that survival the moment you helped me. You talk as if kindness is a crime. In my world," he said, "it often is. And this one." They stood in silence for a moment, the tension between them more visible than the morning light. Then he gestured for her to follow. "I will show you the estate," he said. "You should know where you are if you plan to decide whether to stay or leave." She hesitated but followed. The hallway stretched wide and immaculate, lined with portraits of stern men and graceful women whose eyes seemed to follow her. The walls were marble, the air cool and faintly scented with citrus. As they walked, Adrian spoke little. Guards in dark suits stood at discreet intervals, nodding as he passed. Their presence was constant but quiet, like shadows that knew their purpose. He led her through double doors that opened onto the garden she had seen from her window. The roses were even more striking up close, their fragrance almost overwhelming. Beyond them, an expansive courtyard framed a mosaic fountain. The water shimmered with sunlight. "This is the heart of the estate," Adrian said. "My mother planted these roses. She believed beauty could tame violence." Ava looked around. "Did it work?" "For a time," he said, his tone softer now, "until the world reminded her what family we belonged to." He guided her toward a terrace overlooking the distant city. From here, the skyline appeared peaceful, a reminder of the life she had lost in a single night. "How many people live here?" she asked. "Enough to protect what matters," he said. "Too many to know peace." She studied him in the sunlight, his sharp features, the calm control that never wavered, the faint scar near his temple that hinted at old battles. There was power in him, yes, but also exhaustion, the kind that comes from fighting too long for the right to stand still. "I need to work," Ava said finally. I cannot hide in a mansion while my patients wait. They have other nurses, Adrian said. But there is only one you. And right now, the Petrov Syndicate believes you can lead them to me. They will not stop until they are convinced you are dead or under my protection. The words settled over her like cold water. So, those are my choices, she said. Death or captivity. Protection, he corrected quietly. You may leave whenever you wish, but I would prefer you stayed under conditions we both can live with. What conditions? You help my people when needed, he said. Medical care, discretion. Nothing more. Ava crossed her arms. And if I refuse? He met her gaze evenly. Then I will still protect you. But it will be harder. She hated that a part of her believed him. The rest of the day unfolded slowly. The woman who brought her breakfast, Mrs. Delgado, she learned returned with clothes that somehow fit perfectly. Ava spent hours exploring the estate, the rose gardens, the fountains, the library she glimpsed through an open door. Everything was beautiful, ordered, deliberate. But everywhere she looked, she felt eyes on her. Guards who moved like shadows. Security cameras that never blinked. That night, as the sun bled out behind the hills, Ava stood on the terrace again. The city below glowed like a constellation. Adrian joined her without a sound. You are not a prisoner here, he said quietly. Then why does it feel like one? Because freedom, he said, is not always about the absence of walls. Sometimes it is about who stands outside them waiting. Has also... The wind carried the scent of roses between them. For the first time since the alley, Ava allowed herself to breathe without fear. The fortress was still a cage, but it was also the only place left where she could sleep without looking over her shoulder. And somewhere deep down, beneath the unease and the uncertainty, something else began to stir, a quiet curiosity about the man who ruled this world of roses and steel, and the reason why his eyes softened only when they found her. The days at the Moretti estate settled into a rhythm that felt almost like peace, though Ava Morgan understood that it was an illusion, one maintained by discipline, wealth, and the silent vigilance of men who lived by rules most of the world would never see written. Morning light filtered through the high windows like an uninvited guest, touching the marble floors, glinting off polished brass, illuminating the subtle details of a life governed by precision. Every corner of the mansion spoke of control. The way the curtains fell in perfect symmetry, the timing of footsteps in distant corridors, the stillness that held even the air in obedience. Ava spent her first week keeping to the spaces that felt safe. The garden, the terrace, the library. She had discovered one quiet afternoon when the rest of the house seemed to sleep. The library fascinated her. It was a cathedral of silence. Walls lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Some were classics she recognized. Others bore titles in Italian, Latin, and languages she could not read. But the ones that drew her most were the handwritten ledgers arranged behind a glass cabinet, each bound in black leather, each marked with a single word in gold lettering. Honor, loyalty, blood. Adrian found her there one evening. She had not heard him enter. He seemed to move like part of the house itself, invisible until he chose to appear. Those are my family's records, he said, his voice low, his accent more pronounced in the hush of the room. Every oath sworn, every debt paid, every betrayal marked, the code of the Moretti family. Ava turned toward him. You keep records of that? We have, for generations, he replied. A man's word is nothing if it is not written somewhere it cannot be forgotten. And so it was... She closed the glass door gently, looking at the meticulous handwriting through the reflection. And what happens to those who break their word? They are erased, he said simply. From the books, from memory. The bluntness of the answer chilled her. That sounds like a death sentence. In some cases, he admitted, walking closer, it is. Ava studied him for a moment, the lamplight catching the edge of his jaw. You speak of it as if it is law. It is, he said. My father wrote these codes before I was born. His father wrote before him. I inherited not only the name, but the weight of every word inside those books. She crossed her arms. And what about you? Do you follow those rules or do you make new ones? A faint smile touched his lips. Both. He moved toward one of the tall shelves, running his fingers along the spines of the books like a man tracing his own history. When I was 22, my father was killed. I was given this house, this family, this burden. I did not ask for it, but men like me do not have the luxury of choice. We inherit not freedom, but responsibility. There was no self-pity in his tone, only acceptance, like a soldier describing a scar. Ava watched him, realizing that for the first time he spoke not as the man who commanded armies in suits, but as someone who had once been young, unprepared, and human. What happened to your father? She asked softly. The same thing that happens to anyone who forgets what power truly costs, he said. He trusted a friend who wanted his throne. It cost him his life and nearly the family with it. He looked at her then, eyes deep and unreadable. I learned early that mercy and weakness often look the same to men who crave control. But I've also learned that strength without compassion is another form of death. Ava felt something shift between them, something she could not define. It was not sympathy, nor was it fear. It was recognition. The meeting of two people who had both built walls around their hearts for survival, only to find someone who could see through them. Your world runs on loyalty and vengeance, she said. Mine runs on rules and ethics. We are both taught not to question them, but sometimes I wonder if either is right. Adrian's gaze softened. Perhaps the difference is that I know mine is wrong, he said, but I still live by it. Is which? They stood in silence for a while, the ticking of the old clock filling the room like a heartbeat. Then Adrian opened one of the ledgers and placed it on the table before her. The paper was thick, aged, filled with precise handwriting in black ink. Each entry was a story condensed to a sentence, a name, a debt, a date, a resolution. He pointed to one at the bottom of a page. Do you see this? Ava nodded. Luciano Bianchi, Loyalty Redeemed, 1998. My uncle, Adrian said. He saved my father's life during a raid when I was a child. My father wrote his name here with his own hand. After his death, I wrote it again, so the record would never fade. She traced the gold lettering on the edge of the page with her fingertips. And if I had not found you that night, he met her eyes. Then your name would not be written anywhere and I would not be standing here. There was no charm in his voice, only truth. It landed somewhere deep inside her, unsettling in its simplicity. Later that evening, as the sun sank behind the estate walls, Adrian poured them each a glass of wine. They sat on the terrace overlooking the rose gardens, where the evening wind carried the scent of jasmine and smoke. My family once believed that everything could be solved with power, he said, staring into the fading light. Money, violence, fear, they were tools. But none of them build anything that lasts. You cannot rule a kingdom of ghosts. Then why stay in it, she asked. Because leaving it would destroy what remains, he said. And because sometimes the only way to change a world is from within its walls. He looked at her, and something in his expression made her heart tighten. You make me remember that, he added quietly. Ava turned away, the admission too heavy, too dangerous. I am just a nurse, she said. He shook his head slightly. You are much more than that. You saw me bleeding and did not ask who I was. That kind of courage is rarer than you think. The night deepened around them. The lights from the mansion reflected in the fountain below, shimmering like fragments of broken stars. Ava realized that the longer she stayed here, the harder it became to separate her sense of duty from the pull of something deeper. She did not know what frightened her more, the world outside the walls, or the man within them. When she finally returned to her room, she found one of the ledgers waiting on her desk, closed but deliberate. Tucked beneath it was a small card written in Adrian's elegant handwriting. Trust is the only law that cannot be written. A.M. She sat for a long time, staring at the note, the sound of the distant ocean blending with the whisper of roses outside her window. In that moment, she understood that she was no longer just a guest in his world. She was becoming part of the story, written in those black books, a name not yet inked, but waiting. And somewhere deep inside her, she feared that once her name appeared in those pages, it would never be erased. The calm did not last. Ava Morgan had begun to believe that perhaps the walls of the Moretti estate could hold back the chaos of the outside world, that the gardens and the roses and the endless order could silence the violence that lived beneath them. But peace, she learned, was only ever a pause between storms. It began on a morning so still it felt staged. The sky hung heavy and silver, the air thick with the scent of rain that refused to fall. Ava had been tending to a minor injury in the estate's medical room, a deep cut on the hand of one of the guards when the first sign appeared. The man kept glancing toward the window, muscles tense, eyes moving like those of someone who had already seen what the rest had not. "Something wrong?" Ava asked, pressing a gauze pad to the wound. "Nothing, Miss Morgan," he said quickly, but the lie sat sharp in his voice. "Just a feeling." She finished the bandage and watched him leave, noting how his hand hovered near the holster at his waist. The unease lingered long after he was gone. By midday, the air had changed. The corridors that were usually filled with quiet footsteps now echoed with the low murmur of radios and the distant click of weapons being checked. Ava found Adrian in his study, speaking in low tones to his security chief. His posture was calm, but his eyes were not. "What is happening?" she asked from the doorway. Adrian looked up, his expression tightening just slightly. "Nothing you need to worry about." "I would prefer the truth," she said. The man beside him glanced at her and then at Adrian, uncertain if he should remain. Adrian gave a faint nod, and the man left, closing the door behind him. Adrian rose from behind the desk and walked toward her. "One of my lieutenants has gone silent," he said quietly. "He left the compound at dawn and did not check in. That is unusual." "Do you think he left willingly?" "I think he said that loyalty has a price and someone has offered to pay more." The simplicity of his words chilled her. "You think someone betrayed you?" He met her gaze. "I know it." The afternoon dragged on in a haze of tension. Guards moved in pairs through the estate. Radios crackled with coded words Ava did not understand. She retreated to the garden, but even there the silence felt wrong. The roses that had once seemed like a symbol of peace now stood like sentinels, waiting. By evening, the storm finally came not from the sky, but from within the walls. It began with a shout, then the sound of shattering glass. Ava turned sharply toward the mansion. The stillness exploded into motion, boots pounding, orders shouted in Italian, gunfire cracking like thunder through marble corridors. She ran back inside, heart hammering, the air filled with the acrid bite of smoke and cordite. "Miss Morgan!" a voice shouted. One of the guards, Matteo, a young man with kind eyes, grabbed her arm and pulled her behind a pillar just as a burst of bullets tore through the hallway. "You need to get to the east wing." "Where is Adrian?" she demanded. Matteo hesitated, then cursed under his breath. "In the meeting room. They came for him." She shook her head, fear and instinct colliding. "Then that is where I am going." "You cannot." But she was already moving. The nurse in her could not ignore danger, not when lives were at stake. The sound of battle deepened as she ran, men shouting, glass breaking, the dull boom of something heavy striking stone. Smoke drifted through the air, thick and gray. When she reached the main corridor, she saw 2 guards lying motionless on the floor. She knelt beside one of them, felt for a pulse, found none. The other still breathed, shallow and fast. "I will come back," she whispered, and kept moving. She reached the meeting room and froze at the sight. Adrian stood behind the overturned table, blood blooming on his shoulder, firing a handgun with icy precision. 3 of his men covered the doorway while others returned fire from the courtyard beyond the shattered windows. Outside, the rain had begun to fall, hissing against the stone as if the sky itself had joined the battle. When Adrian saw her, his expression shifted from command to fury. "Ava, get out!" "You are hurt," she said, already crossing the room. He turned his head just long enough to snap an order to his men, then dropped the gun to the floor. "Matteo," he called, "cover her!" As Mater. Ava reached him just as his knees buckled. She caught his weight against her shoulder and pulled him toward the far wall, where the sound of gunfire was distant. "Sit down," she ordered. "You should not be here," he said through clenched teeth. "And yet, here I am." He gave a short, humorless laugh that ended in a hiss of pain. The bullet had grazed the top of his shoulder, tearing through muscle but missing bone. Blood ran down his arm, dark against his white shirt. "I need to stop the bleeding," she said, tearing open the emergency kit she had carried since the night they met. "Stay still." "I do not have time to stay still," he said. "You do if you want to live." His men continued exchanging fire outside, but the sound began to fade. Ava worked quickly, cleaning and dressing the wound with steady hands. Adrian's breathing slowed, his composure returning like a tide finding its shore. "You never listen," he said quietly. "Neither do you," she replied, tightening the bandage. "Consider us even." His lips twitched despite the pain. "Fair enough." Minutes later, the gunfire ceased. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, filled with the smell of smoke and rain. Matteo entered the room, his face pale but resolute. "It is over, sir," he said. "We found the traitor. It was Carlo." Adrian's eyes darkened. "Bring him to the cellar." "Yes, sir." I fear." When they were alone again, Ava sank onto the floor beside him, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline had begun to fade. "You could have died," she said. "I have come close before. That is not an excuse." He looked at her for a long time, the edge in his gaze softening. "You should not have been here, but I am glad you were." She exhaled slowly, exhaustion catching up to her. "You make it very difficult to decide whether I should hate you or keep saving you." Then perhaps, he said, "you should keep doing both." A weak laugh escaped her despite herself. "You are impossible. I have been told worse." They sat there in the dim light as the storm raged outside, the weight of what had just happened settling around them like ash. When the last echoes faded, Adrian reached for her hand. His fingers were warm despite the cold air, his grip steady. "Every empire," he said softly, "is tested by fire. Tonight was ours. We survived. But survival always has a cost." Ava looked down at their joined hands and wondered what that cost would be and who would end up paying it. Hours later, after the wounded were treated and the estate had fallen into uneasy quiet, Adrian stood in the library, staring at the black ledgers lined up like silent witnesses. Ava found him there, his shirt still bloodstained, his shoulders stiff beneath the fresh bandage. "You should rest," she said. "So should you. Rest does not come easily here." "Often." He turned to her, the lamplight catching the tired angles of his face. "No," he said, "it never has." Outside, the roses swayed in the wind, their petals glistening with rain like drops of blood. The fortress still stood, but Ava knew something within it had changed forever. The fire had tested its master and the woman who refused to leave his side. And though the battle was over, the war that followed it had only just begun. The days after the attack moved with a strange, heavy stillness, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The shattered glass was swept from the corridors, the bullet holes in the walls filled and painted over, the scent of smoke replaced by the sharp perfume of fresh roses. From the outside, the Moretti estate appeared untouched. Perfect again, a fortress unscarred. But Ava Morgan could feel the fracture beneath the surface, the subtle hum of tension that no amount of polish could disguise. Adrian Moretti had survived, but survival did not mean safety. It meant calculation, vigilance, and the kind of quiet fury that burned without flame. Ava saw it in the way he spoke to his men. Calm, precise, but colder now, as if trust had become another weapon to be wielded carefully. He spent hours in the library, poring over ledgers and documents, his wounded shoulder bound in fresh bandages she changed each morning. "You are healing well," she told him one afternoon, adjusting the gauze. He gave a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. Physically, perhaps. Ava met his gaze, recognizing the truth behind the words. And otherwise, he looked past her to the window where sunlight filtered through the rain-streaked glass. Otherwise, I am rebuilding. Ah, it was not an answer, but it was all she would get. That evening, the household gathered for dinner in the great hall, a ritual meant to restore order. The men sat straighter, their suits pressed, their faces unreadable. Adrian presided at the head of the table, his presence magnetic and heavy, the weight of leadership resting on his shoulders like an invisible crown. Ava sat at his right, the place he had quietly insisted upon. Conversation was minimal, and every sound, the clink of glass, the scrape of silverware, felt exaggerated in the silence. When the meal ended, Adrian dismissed everyone except her. The others filed out quickly, their respect for him laced with something deeper. Fear. He turned to her when they were alone. "Walk with me," he said. The garden was cool, the night air carrying the scent of wet earth and salt from the distant sea. The roses glowed faintly under the lantern light, their petals trembling in the breeze. Adrian walked beside her in silence for a time, his steps measured, his gaze fixed ahead. "The Petrov Syndicate believes they can strike at weakness," he said finally. "They were wrong, but they will try again. They always do." Ava folded her arms. "You said the same thing after the last attack. How long can you live like this?" "As long as I must," he said. "The world I was born into does not allow retreat, but it can be changed." She looked at him, skeptical. "Changed? You mean controlled?" "No," he said, stopping to face her. "Changed. You think of me as a criminal, a man trapped in blood and power, but I have been working towards something different, something that could outlast the violence that built it." He led her through a side path she had never noticed before, toward a low building near the edge of the property. The guards at the entrance stepped aside without a word. Inside, Ava froze. The space was bright, sterile, filled with medical equipment gurneys, IV poles, oxygen tanks, and shelves stocked with supplies. "This," Adrian said quietly, "is what I have been building." She turned to him in disbelief. "A clinic?" He nodded. "For the people who cannot walk into a hospital without fear, for the families of those who serve me, and for those the city has forgotten. No paperwork, no questions. Only treatment." Ava walked slowly through the room, her fingers brushing over the edge of a stainless steel table. Everything was real, organized, clean, functional. It was not a fantasy. "I started this years ago," he continued. "But it was small, hidden. Your arrival reminded me what it could become." She looked up sharply. "My arrival? You showed me what mercy looks like when it costs something," he said. "I had forgotten that." The words unsettled her. "You do not need me for this," she said. "You could hire doctors, nurses, people who do not live under your shadow." "They would not stay," he said simply. "You would." Ava turned away, her heart pounding. "You do not know that." "I know you," he said, stepping closer. "You say you hate what I am, but part of you understands why I am this way. You heal people who destroy themselves every day and still believe they deserve a second chance. I am no different." "How?" She faced him, anger rising beneath the pull of something she did not want to name. "You kill, Adrian. You make choices that break lives." "And you save them," he said softly. "Perhaps that is why we found each other." The words hung between them, heavy as the air before a storm. The distance between them closed without movement. She could feel the gravity of him, the quiet danger, the unyielding control, the loneliness he never admitted. "Do not turn this into something it is not," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And what is it, Ava?" "It is survival," she said. "Nothing more." He studied her face, the faint tremor in her voice betraying her calm. Then he smiled, slow and knowing. "If that is what you need to call it, then so be it." They stood in silence, the sound of the ocean faint beyond the walls. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. Over the next weeks, Ava began working in the clinic. She treated wounds from sparring accidents, minor illnesses among the staff, and injuries that came without explanation. She asked fewer questions than she once would have. In return, she was given freedom more than she expected, though she understood it was monitored. Adrian visited often, usually late at night when the hallways were quiet. He would stand in the doorway, watching as she cleaned instruments or reviewed notes, his presence filling the room even when he said nothing. Sometimes they spoke of medicine, sometimes of philosophy, sometimes of nothing at all. The silences between them grew heavier, more intimate. One night, he brought her a file. Inside were plans for an expansion of the clinic partnerships with legitimate hospitals, funding for community programs, donations under false names. "You are serious about this," she said. "I do not begin what I do not intend to finish," he replied. "This could change lives," she said, flipping through the pages. "It already has," he said quietly. "Yours, for one." She looked up sharply, ready to deny it, but stopped when she saw his expression. He was not mocking her. He was simply telling the truth. The rain began again, soft and persistent, tapping against the windows like a rhythm only the two of them could hear. "You think you can build redemption out of concrete and glass," she said. "Redemption is not built," he answered. "It is lived." When he turned to leave, she caught his sleeve. "Why me, Adrian?" she asked, her voice trembling in spite of herself. He looked at her for a long time, his green eyes shadowed with something she could not decipher. "Because you see me," he said. "Not what the world says I am. Not even what I pretend to be. You see the man beneath it." She let go of his sleeve, her hand falling to her side. The truth of his words terrified her more than the guns, more than the power, more than the danger outside those walls. That night, Ava lay awake, staring at the ceiling while thunder whispered against the horizon. The clinic stood below her window, its lights glowing faintly in the dark. A promise or a warning, she could not tell. Somewhere inside the mansion, Adrian was awake too. She could feel it, the same restless energy binding them together, drawing her toward him even as her conscience screamed to turn away. The line between light and darkness had blurred beyond recognition. And for the first time, Ava wondered not whether she could leave, but whether she still wanted to. The rain returned with vengeance, hammering against the high windows of the Moretti estate as if the sky itself demanded entry. The world beyond the walls blurred into gray, the city vanishing beneath a veil of thunder and light. Inside, the air carried the low hum of restrained energy, a tension that mirrored the one tightening inside Ava Morgan. Weeks had passed since the night Adrian showed her the clinic, yet its presence continued to haunt her. Each morning, she worked there with quiet purpose, her hands steady, her voice calm, her professionalism flawless. Each night, she found herself restless, her thoughts circling back to him. His presence had become inescapable, a shadow in every room, a warmth she could neither welcome nor deny. The estate was no longer strange to her. She knew the rhythm of its guards, the echo of its marble floors, the scent of the gardens after rain. She knew where Adrian spent his mornings, what time he walked through the courtyard, what kind of tea he drank when he worked late. She knew too much, and yet she could not tell where knowledge ended and obsession began. One evening, as lightning carved the horizon, Ava found herself standing outside the library door. She hesitated, hand raised but not yet touching the handle. The room beyond held not only the ledgers of Adrian's family, but also something far more dangerous truth. She pushed the door open. Adrian sat by the window, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a glass of scotch in his hand. Papers were spread across the desk, before him financial records, business proposals, maps marked in red. He looked up when she entered, his eyes catching the dim light, green and unguarded for once. "You should be resting," he said. "I could say the same to you," she replied. He gestured toward the empty chair opposite him. "Then perhaps neither of us will." Ava sat, the flicker of candlelight reflecting in the glass between them. "You work as if sleep were a sin." "In my world," he said, "it often is." She studied him, noting the faint shadows beneath his eyes. "You cannot fight forever, Adrian. Not the Petrov syndicate, not the ghosts of your family, not yourself." He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "If I stop fighting, everything I have built will fall. It's mine. And if you keep fighting, it will destroy you," she said softly. He gave a quiet laugh, the sound rough at the edges. "You speak as though you care what happens to me." I saved your life, she said, her voice sharper than she intended. That is not something I forget easily. He watched her closely, the corner of his mouth curving faintly. No, he said, you never forget. That is both your gift and your curse. The storm outside cracked, thunder rolling like distant artillery. Adrian rose and moved toward the window, the candlelight tracing the hard lines of his shoulders. When I was a boy, he said, my father told me that power demands solitude, that a man who rules cannot afford to love. It makes him weak. Was he wrong? Ava asked. Adrian turned to face her. He was right, but weakness, he said slowly, is not always a curse either. She stood too, her pulse quickening, though she did not move closer. What do you want from me? His expression softened, the edge of control faltering for the briefest second. The truth, I do not know anymore. They stood there, the distance between them charged with unspoken things. The storm pressed harder against the windows, the air thick with the scent of rain and something else, tension, desire, fear. When Adrian spoke again, his voice was quiet. You could leave, Ava. You could walk out that door, take the car waiting at the gate, disappear. No one would stop you. She met his gaze. Is that what you want? No, he said, but it may be what you need. Ava's breath caught, the simplicity of his words cutting deeper than any declaration could. You think I am a prisoner here. I think, he said. You are torn between two worlds. One that believes in saving everyone and one that believes not everyone can be saved. She took a step toward him. And which world do you belong to? He smiled faintly. The one that built the walls. Is down. The silence stretched. The rain beat harder. The moment balanced on the edge of something inevitable. Adrian set his glass down and crossed the room in 2 strides. When he stopped in front of her, the air seemed to change temperature. His voice dropped, barely more than a whisper. You do not belong here, Ava, and yet you do. Her breath trembled. You think you can decide that for me? No, he said. I think you already have. Oh, once. Lightning flashed, illuminating his face, the scar near his temple, the exhaustion and yearning that lived in the same gaze. Ava felt something inside her break open, not surrender, but understanding. The distance between them disappeared. When he reached for her, she did not step back. The touch was not forceful but inevitable, as if it had been written long before either of them knew it. His hand brushed her cheek, tracing the line of her jaw. For the first time since the alley, Ava did not feel fear. She felt seen. Entirely, dangerously seen. You should not, she whispered. I already have, he said. The thunder drowned the rest of the world. The candlelight flickered, shadows colliding, as his lips found hers slow, restrained, then desperate, as though both had run out of reasons to pretend. The kiss was not gentle. It was confession and denial at once, a surrender disguised as defiance. When it ended, they stood breathless, the storm raging around them. This changes nothing, Ava said, her voice shaking. It changes everything, Adrian replied. He stepped back, the control returning to his expression piece by piece. Go, he said quietly, before you forget how to. She wanted to argue, to demand what he meant, but she saw it in his eyes fear, not for himself, but for her. Without another word, she turned and left the library, her heartbeat echoing in the corridors long after the thunder had faded. That night, Ava lay awake, listening to the storm move across the sea. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, the way he looked at her, the way his voice had softened when he said her name. The world she had once believed in felt distant, almost imaginary. In the darkness, she realized that something irreversible had happened. It was not love, not yet, but something more dangerous, the beginning of it. And though she knew the cost, she also knew she would pay it. Because for the first time in years, Ava Morgan no longer felt like she was running from something. She was running toward it. Dawn came slow and gray, deepening the lines of the world instead of softening them. The Moretti estate lay under a hush that felt deliberate, like a held breath before a verdict. Ava Morgan stood at the window of the clinic, watching the mist lift from the gardens. The roses shone with dew, their petals trembling in the faint breeze. The peace looked complete. It was not. Beneath the quiet, something waited. She could feel it in the air, in the way footsteps in the halls moved with a sharper rhythm, in the way radios whispered and then went silent when she entered a room. The storm inside her had not passed. It had clarified. She had kissed Adrian Moretti in the library and walked away before she forgot how. She had not slept. Each time her eyes closed, she saw the truth of his gaze and the truth of her own reflection inside it. She was not the woman who went down that alley anymore. She had crossed a line none of her training had prepared her to face. She had chosen to see a man under power and power under a man, and the recognition had become a knot she could neither loosen nor cut. By mid-morning, the mist had burned away. The city shimmered on the horizon, clear and distant. Adrian entered the clinic without ceremony, dressed in a charcoal suit that made him look like the first sentence of a decision. His wound had healed well. He moved without stiffness now, the power in his posture undiminished, the guarded calm back in his eyes. "We have intelligence," he said, as if he were continuing a conversation that began in another life. "The Petrov Syndicate will make their move today." Ava set a tray of instruments on the counter and turned to face him. "Here. Not at the estate," he said. "In the city. They think they can force my hand in public, where control is more fragile. They are not wrong. And you will meet them," she said. "I have delayed as long as I can," he replied. "Delay invites chaos. I will not allow them to choose the ground on which I stand." She hated the inevitability in his voice. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to remain here," he said. "You will be safe. If my men are injured, they will be brought to you." "Your men," she said, "and you." He held her gaze without blinking. "If I fall, this ends." Silence stretched between them. Ava knew the shape of what she must say, but her voice did not obey. The decision lived in a deeper place than speech. "You told me last night I could leave," she said finally. "You told me no one would stop me." "And I meant it," he said. "I also meant what I did not say. If you stay inside my life. There is no door that leads back to before." "Before was gone the moment I found you in the rain," she said. He did not argue. He reached for her hand and did not take it, his palm hovering inches from her fingers as if the space itself were an oath. "Ava," he said softly, "choose with both eyes open." The call came an hour later. A convoy had been spotted near the river district, moving with the confidence of men who thought they owned the street. Adrian left with a precision that looked like serenity from the outside and felt like a knife to Ava's ribs. Engines faded down the drive. The estate closed around itself, drawing its walls tight. The clinic lights burned clean and bright. The clock on the wall ticked in perfect time. Minutes stretched. Then came the first wave. 2 men arrived with gunshot wounds to the legs and arms, bleeding but stable. Ava worked quickly, her hands sure. Her orders clicked. She cleaned, sutured, stabilized. She sent one to imaging, set a fracture in another. Her voice was steady. Her mind moved faster than fear. She barely felt her own breath. The second wave hit harder. 3 men came in at once, one with a wound to the abdomen that demanded choice, another with a collapsed lung, the third pale with blood loss and shock. The clinic became a battlefield without sound, only the rhythm of work and the cadence of life reclaiming itself inch by inch. She inserted a chest tube, watched the hiss of trapped air become the soft rise of breath. She clamped an artery, stilled the red torrent into an obedient trickle. She pushed fluids, titrated medication, counted heartbeats until the numbers began to sing again. Between cases, the radios clicked and muttered. Words slipped out like stones. Peer, flank, advance, hold. Then a new word cut through the static like a blade. Adrian. Ava looked up so quickly the room tilted. Mateo stood in the doorway, rain on his shoulders and a slice across his cheek that he had not yet noticed. "He is alive," Mateo said, reading the terror in her face and answering it first. "He is bringing this to an end." But he is hit. Where? Ava said. Shoulder. Clean entry. We have applied pressure. There is more, he added, as if he had to teach his throat to shape the rest. He has their leader. He has him on the ground. He is waiting. Waiting for what? Ava asked, though she knew. For his choice, Mateo said. They brought Adrian in at last, not on a stretcher, but between two men who looked like younger versions of him, carved from loyalty. He had lost blood, but his steps were measured, and his eyes were clear. He sat at the edge of the treatment table without complaint, without drama, offering his arm the way a soldier offers a flag to hands he trusts more than his own. Ava cleaned the wound and worked in silence. The bullet had passed through muscle but missed the artery. It would ache, it would scar, it would not kill. She closed the edges with even stitches and dressed the shoulder in white. When she finished, she allowed herself to breathe. Tell me, she said. Adrian watched her gloved hands for a long moment, as if the answer were written across her knuckles. I have Sergei Petrov, he said. Alive. He ordered the ambush at the garage. He ordered the breach at the estate. He sent men to pull you off the street because he believed mercy could be used as a weapon. What will you do? Ava asked. Adrian's gaze did not waver. I will end this. There are 1,000 ways to end a war, she said. Only some of them leave a world worth living in. Is a activist. He rose from the table and stood so close she could see the faint pulse in his throat. You asked me once whether I make new rules or follow the old ones, he said. The answer is simple. I do both. But I have learned there is one law that exists above the rest. She knew the words before he spoke them. She had found them in his handwriting, tucked beneath a ledger like a secret. Trust is the only law that cannot be written. He turned to go. She caught his wrist, feeling the heat of his skin through the bandage. If you kill him, she said, you will win and lose in the same breath. If I do not, he answered, I risk the lives of everyone under my protection. Then do what your father could not, she said. Break the cycle and keep the power. The world held still. Outside, the roses shifted in a soft wind, petals whispering against one another like a prayer made of silk. Adrian looked at her as if he were seeing the map of a country he had fought for but never entered. Come, he said. They drove back to the river district where the asphalt smelled like rain and iron. The pier was a geometry of shadows and light, men standing in a ring around a single figure, kneeling with his hands bound, his face swollen but unbroken. Sergei Petrov lifted his head as Adrian approached, something like disdain moving through his eyes and dying there. You want to watch, Sergei said to Ava, voice thick with blood. You want to see what your king is when the doors are open. Ava stood beside Adrian and did not flinch. I am here to see what he will become. The ring tightened. The river moved beneath the pier with the patience of time. Adrian spoke, and the sound carried without force. This is finished, he said. You will withdraw from this city. You will release every debt that ties to my name. You will not return. Sergei laughed, and the laugh broke into a cough. You will never hold it. Not without blood. Adrian looked at him, and then at the men who had followed him through rooms of smoke and corridors of fire. He saw a future made of ledgers without additions and gardens without alarms. He lifted his hand, and every gun in the ring lowered, the quiet more violent than any thunder. You are leaving, he said to Sergei. You will live to know that I did not choose your law. So, it felt like a wound torn open without bleeding. It felt like a door closing that would never open again. Mateo stepped forward, delivered the conditions, the routes, the eyes that would watch the exits of the city until the last shadow passed the last corner. The decision traveled the ring like heat. It settled. It held. When they returned to the estate, the night was clean and the air tasted like a beginning. The clinic lights glowed. The fountain whispered. The books in the library lined their shelf like boundaries that could be honored without being obeyed. On the terrace, Ava stood beside Adrian and watched the city breathe. He did not touch her. He did not need to. You made your choice, she said. So did you, he answered. She turned to him, feeling the strange peace that arrives only when consequence is embraced instead of feared. I am not going back to my apartment, she said. I am not going back to a life that pretends the world is simple. I will stay. Not as a prisoner, not as a decoration, as the woman who will tell you the truth when it costs us both. Adrian's eyes softened in a way that looked like dawn. Then we will build what does not yet exist, he said. A house where power serves mercy and mercy does not make us weak. Below them the roses moved, endless and bright. The city lifted its lights like a crown. The night drew a line through everything that had been and everything that would follow, and Ava Morgan stepped across it without looking back.